Hey, good evening. I'm Tom Yamas. Our coverage of the first and only vice presidential debate on NBC News Now is just getting started. My colleague Hallie Jackson will join me in just a moment. I'm live from the Spin Room in New York City, where we'll hear from some top advisors to both campaigns and from undecided battleground voters. The big question, were any minds changed tonight? You see this handshake right here between the two candidates in a debate that kicked off with a question on the unfolding situation in the Middle East, with Senator JD Vance defending former President Trump's approach to the region while he was president.
They needed to recognize that if they got out of line, the United States global leadership would put stability and peace back in the world.
And Governor Tim Walz attacking the former president, saying many of his former national security advisors have spoken out against him.
It's those that were closest to Donald Trump that understand how dangerous he is when the world is this dangerous.
The debate also featuring some tense moments, such as Vance going after the moderators after they tried to fact-check him about the legal status of Haitian immigrants in his home state.
Springfield, Ohio, does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status. Right. Temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy. Thank you.
Margaret, the rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on.
As for Governor Walz, he stumbled through an answer on some discrepancies in past comments he made on China, seeming to admit he misspoke in the past about when he actually visited the country.
I've tried to do the best I can, but I've not been perfect, and I'm a knucklehead at times.
There were a couple of heated back and forths, including when Walz challenged Vance on his non-answer about who won the 2020 election. Listen.
I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
But surprising for this day and age, we did hear at times where they agreed.
I actually think, I agree with you. I think you want to solve this problem, but I don't think that Kamala Harris does.
Much of what the senator said right there, I'm in agreement with him on this.
Tim just said something that I agree with.
I agree with a lot of what Senator Vance said about what's happening. His running mate, though, does not, and that's the problem.
All right, joining us now live in the Spin Room is NBC's Garrett Hake. And Garrett, I understand that Senator JD Vance has just entered, maybe just to the left of us. I think you got eyes on him. Tell us what you can see.
Yeah, Tom, he's sitting down just behind me on the Fox News set. As you can see, the intimate confines of the Spin Room have gotten even more crowded here since the debate concluded and the surrogates started to come in, none of them drawing more attention than Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, and Vance himself coming in. You won't be surprised to know the Trump campaign is thrilled with JD Vance's performance. You heard that from several of their senior advisors. You heard it from Donald Trump Jr. I expect you're going to hear it from JD Vance himself, and we certainly heard it from Donald Trump throughout the course of the debate, commenting over and over again on Truth Social about how well he thought Vance was doing, how poorly he thought the moderators were doing. And I'll just say, Tom, I think there's sort of two key things if we get an opportunity to talk to JD Vance about this tonight, questions left unanswered. The Trump campaign and tonight Vance's inability to really explain the mass deportations policy that they have put out here time and time again, how they will do that without separating families. I've heard Vance take that question repeatedly. I heard the same answer tonight that he always gives that lacks a lot of context and information. And then on Obamacare and what happened to Obamacare during the Trump administration, a wholesale and complete rewriting of history when it comes to the Trump administration's effort to get rid of that law. I covered all of it on Capitol Hill. JD Vance's position is 100% inconsistent with lived reality of what the Trump administration did with Obamacare during that time period. I hope I'll get a chance to ask him about that tonight. But as you can see, there are quite a lot of people trying to ask the same questions I am, and he may not take any of those questions beyond those that are going to be asked to him on the Fox News set.
Garrett, I'm curious, has the Trump campaign at all mentioned how this debate sort of felt almost pre-Trumpish in the sense that there was not any name calling, it didn't get nasty, and for the most part, both candidates were pretty civil?
Yeah, I haven't heard anything specifically from the Trump campaign on that, Tom, but it is striking. I mean, if you go back to any debate before 2015, this is more like what you would have expected. Candidates looking for opportunities to agree with each other, looking for opportunities to appear more civil, looking for opportunities to raise the sort of tenor and tone of the dialogue to a higher place. We got some of that tonight in what is, I think, for many voters probably feels more like an extra credit project, watching the VP debate, which almost never moves the needle in actual elections. Again, tonight, maybe one for the super fans, but those who turned in, I think, got a lot of substance out of what happened on stage tonight.
Garrett Hake, the extra credit project. I have a feeling Garrett maybe worked on a lot of those. Anyways, Garrett, we thank you, and we're going to check back with you. Let us know if you end up getting Senator Vance. I have Kelly O'Donnell here with us right now. Kelly, I'm sure the Democrats in the White House are spinning you pretty hard. What is their take on the debate? I think they have to be somewhat happy because talking to sources on both sides, this is the first debate out of the three where you have Republicans saying we won and you have Democrats saying we won. The last two, there were clear winners.
One of the things that I'm struck by is what you were just talking to Garrett about, and that is the tone, and that these candidates did speak to each other in a civil way. And what I've been hearing from Harris Walz associates is that Governor Walz didn't want a food fight. He wanted to make the appearance of leadership. And who are they going after? Of those extra credit watchers, they want those who have not made up their mind. And so appealing to those who might not want to see some of the ugliness of our national discourse. Certainly, Governor Walz was nervous at the beginning. They acknowledged that right out of the gate. Also, governors, having covered so many of them, are most comfortable with domestic issues because that's what they're dealing with. That first question early on in the debate, dealing with today's events in the Middle East, was not a comfortable space for Governor Walz. But they believe that when he talked about the issues relating to January 6th and women's health care, that he scored very well among the voter groups they were watching. And they believe that his sort of normal guy vibe was something that voters could relate to.
Yeah, it was clear in the beginning he was very nervous, stumbled a couple times, but then when it got to the domestic issues, he felt much more comfortable. That is clear.
We were nervous watching because the stakes are high.
Right. What was the take on the response to the questions over Hong Kong and him misrepresenting what actually happened?
Well, he sort of got there with I misspoke at the end and took a lot of time to get there. And so it's been one of the criticisms of Governor Walz that he is not always careful with his words, that he sometimes describes life events in a way that might be adding a little something extra. Certainly, they recognize that he needed to clean that up. They believe that he did that and that normal people do similar things. In the political space, you don't always get a lot of credit for that. What he did not do is he didn't pivot and talk about Donald Trump and his record on truth-telling or not. So that might have been an area where he could have approached it differently, but they knew that was going to be an issue.
It's actually interesting you bring that up because a couple of Republican strategists pointed out to me that Vance actually didn't attack him on that, and so the thinking might have been that if Vance would have gone more on, it would have drawn that on the former President Smith's truths as well. We thank you so much, Kelly.
Good to be with you.
Stand by for us. I'm here in the spin room, as we've been saying, but my co-anchor, Hallie Jackson, is over in our 30 Rock studios as our coverage continues. And, Hallie, I got to tell you, I've been hearing from a lot of viewers. I've been hearing from people in the political space who they're just calling the debate, they're calling it refreshing. They're saying that, it was dense with policy. It was definitely different. But they're also calling it refreshing because it reminded them of a time sort of pre-2016, 2015, when the debates would get so heated and sort of Donald Trump sort of turned the political world upside down.
I mean, you and I were out there, pounding the pavement during those 2016 days. Tom, I remember for some of those early Republican primary debates where, it was spicy before we knew how spicy it could get. So interesting moments there. And I'm looking behind you there because I understand that now JD Vance is on the spin room floor. I'll check with our control room. You may be able to see him, Tom. He had just done, I think, a hit on Fox News. He is getting ready to get over onto the spin room floor. We're going to watch to see if he speaks. Governor Walz, we understand, has now left the area. And I got to say, Tom, this is probably the closest you and I have been for one of these post-debate shows because you're just a few blocks away from me here in Midtown Manhattan in New York City. I'm here alongside our Meet the Press moderator, Kristen Welker, and our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. NBC's chief political analyst, Chuck Todd, is joining us as well. So there's a lot to get into here. And Kristen and Peter, I'll start with you. And then, Chuck, I want you to jump in as well. This is obviously maybe the last word that we will see in a primetime stage from anybody in this ticket here. One of the things that we all talked about prior to this debate happening were the favorability numbers, right? Governor Walz has the highest of any person on the ticket. Senator Vance has the lowest. Did anything change that tonight? And does likability matter?
Well, look, likability could matter around the edges, particularly when you are dealing with such a close race, because any and everything could impact voters when a race is this close, particularly if you look at the polls in the battleground states. It was very clear that Senator Vance knew that his challenge tonight was to be more likable. And Hallie, I got texts from Republicans who
they're very happy. I'll tell you,
he had an incredibly strong night.
That's right.
And Democrats who acknowledge he came off as likable on some of the issues, by the way, that they felt as though Walz should have been on offense and Vance should have been on defense, like abortion. One Democrat saying to me that he felt as though there were some missed opportunities there on Walz's part. Having said all of that, I do think that the final moment of the debate will be one of the most significant, one that will loom over the rest of the debate, which is when Governor Walz asked Vance point blank, did Donald Trump lose the election? And he said, I want to focus on the future. And of course, he called that a non-answer. And the significance of that, I think, because democracy has been rising as a key issue for voters. So when you think about what voters care about, that is one of them. And again, when you talk about, does this matter? It matters because this race is so close, and winning over or alienating some of those undecided voters around the edges can make a difference.
Candidly, I would say that the Democrats are probably happy that the presidential debate matters a lot more than the vice presidential debate. Clearly, JD Vance was a much more polished communicator. For those who have said, you know, he may be unlikable, he delivered the message that he wanted to get across tonight most of the time. You can agree or disagree with what he was saying, but I think that's the biggest takeaway here. I think there were two things that struck me in particular. One is they tried to determine who this was a referendum on. Tim Walz tried to make this election a referendum on Donald Trump and the way he created this country during his time in office. JD Vance tried to make it a referendum on the Biden and Harris administration, all these times saying that this is Harris's policies.
Unlike Donald Trump, didn't drop Joe Biden's name a whole bunch of times. He focused very much on Kamala Harris.
But at the end of the day, I mean, think about it. Tonight we said we had, you know, Taylor Swift's name was mentioned once, Ukraine was mentioned 0 times, right? At the end of the day, I think that the decisions are made by big issues and, most importantly, how they are viewed by, as we look at Tim Walz, by these others.
So as D.C. people, we know what it's like to try to get a slice of pizza in town. New York City pizza, nothing like it. He is at New York Pizza getting a late-night snack in an off-the-record capacity. Let me, what they call an OTR stop, I should say. Let me listen in real quick and see if we can hear.
Up there? Yep.
All right, so he's picking out a slice. We've got the audio up here, just in case he takes any questions.
Does he cut it with a fork and knife? That can be a politically advantageous or problematic decision.
That's a deep pull, Peter, for the younger folks watching. Chuck, let me bring you into the conversation as we keep an eye on this. We're, of course, looking to see Senator Vance over in the spin room here. What's interesting is while there is a discussion, and I've heard this from folks who I was in touch with on text during the debate, a discussion of policy. A lot of folks thought this was substantive. I would put this to you. There were a lot of policy questions. There was discussion about various policies. There weren't necessarily a whole lot of super clear policy answers on some of these outstanding queries that came up.
No, there was a lot of polite word salad, both by Governor Walz and Senator Vance, where they would be respectful of it and they would come say something about agreement.
Hey, Chuck, I'm going to be so annoying. I'm sorry. He's talking to the report. Oh, God, we missed it. I'm sorry. It's like one of these awkward things, right? Like he's going to pick out the pizza. He's going to say how he thinks he did in the debate. We want to catch that, but it's like this, you know, audio situation here. So keep going, and I might interrupt you again.
No worries. No worries. No, hey, it's live TV. That's the whole point. The real question is, will he fold the pizza, right, and eat it that way? You got to fold it in half if you're going to get the big floppy, right? And you better get a big floppy slice, right? The double, you know. For me, I have flashbacks to Cazzolis. All right, that's what a kid of the '80s went to a mall and got a Cazzolis. But anyway. But going back, you're right, in fairness. Look, I thought the issue matrix that CBS came up with was terrific. There were really only 2 issues we didn't touch on that I thought were missing. One was the threat to China, to the Pacific Rim, and one, of course, is the threat of Russia and Ukraine. But we got to a lot of domestic issues, or at least certainly the questions were there, and they were almost afraid of the details. Look, Vance was a much better performer. I think we knew that going in. This is pretty much what he's done his adult life, is talk and debate, right? He hasn't had a lot of other experiences, and I say this with respect. I mean, that's what a U.S. Senator does, and he was quite good at this. And I'd also bring up one other issue. I think you can tell the difference. Which candidate does plenty of TV interviews, even with tough interviewers like Kristen Welker, and which candidate does not do tough interviews with people like Kristen Welker? It's Tim Walz, right? And Walz totally face-planted on that question about his fish story about Tiananmen Square. And I think had he done a few interviews that with the mainstream media, with not just with people that want him to succeed, he'd have gotten better at these answers. I think Vance's performance was better because he faced challenging interviews. And, you know, there's no better debate prep for these presidential and vice presidential candidates than a good, tough accountability interview. And I think the Harris-Walz campaign is playing a prevent defense that is, I think there's a reason why Kamala Harris wants another debate. She needs another format, and if they're going to sit here and be afraid of doing media interviews, they need something. And I think Walz's uneven performance, I think he had some strong moments, particularly when he was prosecuting a case against Trump. But I think his inability to defend the Biden-Harris administration very well at times, and of course his faceplant on the fish story about Tiananmen Square, I think is a reminder that, you know, they haven't done much batting practice here with tough interviewers.
Which is interesting, Chuck, and just to give folks a sense of it, I don't know if we have that live shot still up. If you were looking at JD Vance in the spin room, that's because he's currently doing, I think, a cable news interview. We expect him, we think it is likely that he will come down on the floor. He'll probably chat with Garrett. He might stop by and see Tom. I don't know. We're going to take you back to the spin room when that happens, as, of course, Governor Walz has just stopped with his wife to get a late-night slice of pizza, I think here in Midtown, New York Pizza, not too far from where we are. To pick up on Chuck's point, I was struck, Peter, by Jen Psaki, somebody who you know well from covering the White House, former, of course, White House staffer, former campaign staffer.
She said just this.
Exactly, that she believes that they are doing a disservice to Governor Walz and to Vice President Harris by not getting him out more when he was the guy, as she noted and as we all noted, who came up with the whole weird attack doing one of these cable news interviews on Donald Trump in the first place.
Yeah, and it was that weird attack, right, as you say, that went viral, that made him very conversational, folksy, and likable by a lot of Americans, frankly, as they got to know him. He was plus 13, as they say, 13 points more in terms of the people that liked him than those who didn't like him. That's a positive thing, but you didn't really get to see a lot of that guy in the conversations we've been having with people close to him. I think, candidly, the way that he was prepared for that debate, there's going to be some frustration, not around some of those people who knew him best. He acknowledged going into tonight on nights like this, he's not as good of a debater. None of that really matters, though, at the end of the day. This was the high water mark for both of these candidates. Tomorrow, the conversation, again, is about Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, right? So he wasn't able to take advantage on it. The question, I think, really more than anything for me right now is Kamala Harris's numbers were as good as they have been so far 2 weeks after her debate. Now we're getting further and further away from her debate. We're seeing a little bit of erosion in her numbers right now. And with crises going on from the floods in the southeast due to the Hurricane Helene, with what's happening overseas between Israel, Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas right now, where does she find another moment to sort of go viral, to get people's attention again?
I'm looking away from you, Peter, not because I'm not absolutely hanging on every word, but because I'm looking at what Senator Vance is talking about here, because he was asked about something that Chuck and you have just talked about, which is this idea that perhaps Governor Walz felt nervous at parts of the debate. And Senator Vance says he didn't notice it. He says he himself was nervous because he acknowledges this is the biggest stage of his life. He tried not to focus on the demeanor too much, but an interesting acknowledgement there from the senator.
It is an interesting acknowledgement. It goes back to the civility that we've been talking about throughout the evening, that this was a remarkably civil debate, particularly in the wake of the debate that we all covered of former President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. I do think, to Peter's point, the question becomes about strategy now, because the polls are getting tighter. And with thanks to Chuck for his comments about doing a tough interview, will she start to give more interviews? Does the campaign decide that that is now going to be part of their equation in order to move the needle and in order to try to regain the momentum that she clearly had after she was first at the top of the ticket and after her debate with former President Trump? So I think that that's going to be a big question. We'll have to see what they decide. But I do think go back to the Iran exchange, the very first exchange of this entire debate.
By the way, top of mind to Peter's point.
Yes,
very newsy, breaking
October
developments
surprise.
there today.
Here we are with an October surprise. It framed the entire debate in some ways because that was the moment where you saw both of them trying to say, you're the incumbent. No, you, meaning former President Trump is the incumbent. Vice President Kamala Harris is the incumbent. She's currently in the White House. And it was very clear that that's going to be the strategy of these two campaigns moving forward.
Who has ownership of this idea of being a change candidate or not? I think Chuck is still with us because the interesting thing here, we've been saying this 35 days until Election Day, right? But keep in mind, some voters in battleground states are already getting their early ballots. You've got Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin coming up in the next 2 weeks. You've got Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada all starting their early in-person and mail-in voting. I mean, voters are out there, right? Like, we don't have to wait until November 5th for people to start making their decisions. And so all of these become data points to feed in to folks who are getting out there in these critical states.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. This is the complaint. Donald Trump is making the argument, hey, people are already voting. It's too late for us to debate again. You'll remember in 2016 and 2020, of course, he did debate after people were already voting here. But I think that Kamala Harris is the one, frankly, that would benefit more by another debate, not just because she did so well in the first one, but really she's the one who's still, in a way, introducing herself to some of those undecided voters, those voters that have yet to come around. I started the conversation at the beginning of this. If you weren't with us then, I'll repeat it now, which is to the Harris folks that I'm speaking to. They say that little sliver of voters, the undecided ones are still voting on, they say they are young, they're most often male, and they're racially diverse. But it's a small sliver, and it's people who are not watching tonight's debate. You got to find those people where they are, and the Harris campaign is quietly trying to do that. Are they able to get to them in time for November 5th?
I'm curious to see what that focus group that our friend and colleague Kate Snow sat down with had to say. But before we do that, let me take it back to Tom in the spin room there, where it is getting, I know, super active. Tom, talk me through it.
Hey, Hallie, great to see you again. I want to bring in Senator Amy Klobuchar. She's the Democrat, of course, from Minnesota, whose good friend is Governor Tim Walz. He's your governor. How do you do tonight?
I thought he did a great job. He followed his North Star, and he was blunt, and he was true to himself. We've always said he's not going to be slick. He's not going to pick, like, the longest words and the most perfect orator. Yeah. But he made his point on really three big things. Affordable Care Act. You got JD Vance scrambling around saying, hey, we're protected from getting thrown off our insurance if we have a pre-existing condition. That's the Affordable Care Act that Donald Trump is trying to overturn. On abortion, Tim Walz clear. On standing up for the freedom of women to make their own decisions on their health care, and JD Vance doubling down on Donald Trump's position, which was overturning Roe v. Wade.
You know, Democrats had said that he was nervous, and it looked like he was a little nervous right off the get-go. When the debate started, to be honest with me, did you get a little worried as well? Because it was a rough first 30 seconds.
It's like having your brother out there, okay, and you get that first question. I think anyone. I was on those presidential debate stages, and I would watch my colleagues, jab into the air, drink tons of water before they went out there. It's never easy. Yeah. And while J.D. Vance was on an international book tour and is a lawyer, Tim Walz was a teacher, and then he did a great job in Congress, one of the most bipartisan, and then goes into the governor's office. So it's a very different track.
Yeah. Let's roll two moments. We're going to start with that moment when he was asked about China and his comments about Hong Kong, and then after we'll play another moment. Let's roll the Hong Kong first, though.
Okay.
The question was, can you explain the discrepancy?
All I said on this was I got there that summer and misspoke on this. So I will just, that's what I've said. So I was in Hong Kong and China during the democracy protests went in. And from that, I learned a lot of what needed to be in governance.
So the question was about comments he's made twice now about saying that he was in Hong Kong during the Tiananmen Square protest. He was not. He acknowledged that. But this is the third or fourth time he said something that hasn't been true or it's been an exaggeration. Does Governor Walz have a problem with the truth?
No. This was a mistake. He was there that year. It was a few months off. And, of course, there was much discussion at that time about what happened in Tiananmen Square. And so what I look at it is he made an error. He admitted he made an error, unlike Donald Trump, who wouldn't even admit that Joe Biden won the election. That's a pretty different thing. Yeah. And he then goes on, in an incredible way to serve our country, to be our governor. So I just don't see this. It's nothing but an error. Everyone makes mistakes.
Do you think
and
we'll
what's
see more of these,
most important to me is not if you make one mistake about a few months off, but if you are unwilling, as JD Vance was, to admit the results of an election. What does that mean for our democracy going forward?
Yeah, that was quite the moment at the end of the debate. I do want to ask you about the issue of abortion, because it came a lot during this debate. It was one of the most talked about issues. Here was a moment for Governor Walz. Let's listen.
The fact of the matter is, how can we as a nation say that your life and your rights, as basic as the right to control your own body, is determined on geography?
Do Democrats believe the issue of abortion care is going to make or break this election? Do you think that's what it's going to come down to? If you pick a single issue at the end of the day, when it comes to swing voters, when it comes to some of those suburban moms in those swing states, is it going to be over abortion access?
It's not the only issue. People are really worried about costs, and I believe that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz's economic plan is the right way to go. Focus on child care and housing. But this is clearly part of people's freedoms, and you see it from the prairies of Kansas to a 13-point difference in Ohio on a referendum, to the legislative races in Virginia, the governor's race in Kentucky, a congressional race in Alaska. All over our country, people are standing up, whether they are Democrats, Republicans, or independents, saying, we agree with Tim Walz that women should have the right to make their own decision about the health care. And when JD Vance starts talking about, oh, my heart is with you, these women who families where a woman has died or bled out in the parking lot. No, your heart's not with someone if your policies are heartless. And that is the problem with their position on abortion.
Be honest with me here. What's keeping you up at night about this election? And I ask you that because the race is razor tight. But when we look at the polls in the battleground states, Harris has an advantage, might be maybe half a point. In other states, maybe 2. Trump is on top. But if that is the case, we know that Trump voters are underpolled. It's happened in 2016 and 2020. Are you worried that Trump may have the advantage right now? Does that keep you up at night?
I just don't see that. I see after Joe Biden made the selfless decision to get out of the race, you saw a dramatic change in some of those swing states where Democrats were behind. Kamala Harris united our party, brought in Republicans to speak at the convention. She's got Dick Cheney supporting her, Liz Cheney supporting her. Jeff Flake just announced he's supporting her, the former senator from Arizona, Republican Senator Jimmy McCain. I mean, you just go through the numbers here. So she is reaching out to people in a big way. That's why she is pulling ahead. And what I lose sleep at night is just, we only have 35 days. You know, we've got to keep getting out there. We've got to keep the information out there. And I'm cheering the inauguration no matter who wins. So I've also, when I hear JD Vance out there and won't agree to certifying an election in minute 90, and I think about what we went through on January 6th at 3:30 in the morning, walking over that broken glass to finally get that election, those results certified. It was Mike Pence, me, and Roy Blunt. I don't want to go through that again, and I want to have a president that respects our democracy.
Unions are so important across the country, especially in your state, especially to the Democratic coalition. Are you worried at all about the sports strike?
Anyone would be worried because not politically worried. You're worried that you want to make this work. You want to make it work for the economy work. And I know that President Biden, Vice President Harris, Secretary Buttigieg have been doing everything to try to bring the two sides together. And that's the right thing to do.
Senator Klobuchar, thank you so much for joining us and answering all our questions. We appreciate it. Yeah, Hallie, I'm going to send it back to you in the studio in New York.
All right, Tom, thank you very much. We've been talking about what voters think about what we all just watched over the course of the last 90 minutes. To find out, let's bring in our NBC News senior national correspondent, Kate Snow, who watched that debate with voters, some of whom, Kate, have settled on who they want, some of whom are undecided, but all of them live in the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. You know, my home state, Kate. Talk me through what you're hearing from folks.
That's right. Yeah, and they all live within the confines, right around Pittsburgh, and we're in Pittsburgh right now. And I have to say, this is Allegheny County, Hallie, and you probably know this, but last election, there were 25 municipalities here where the vote was within 5%. So, I mean, it is tight in this county, and you all know that. You all feel that there's a lot of pressure on these swing areas. To be clear, some of you had made up your minds going into the debate. We had two really very much pro-Harris. You were probably for Harris. You guys were you were more unsure. And then we had two people who were really considering Donald Trump, including Brian. And Brian, I want to go to you because it's been fascinating to get your read on what happened tonight. Because it seemed like you went in sort of wanting to like JD Vance and thinking about Trump.
Yeah, so I really did. You're right about that. He just danced around a lot of questions, and I think I said earlier that Walz was sort of like placating to the people, and Vance was just sort of dancing around questions. So my opinion on things really hasn't changed too much tonight, but
you're drawn to Trump because of economic considerations.
Definitely.
That's the big thing for you.
Yeah.
But everything else, it seems like you're maybe drawn to Harris.
Yes, certainly. So very sort of socially liberal, I guess. I mean, I thought if you were going to say who won tonight, I would say that Tim Walz won.
I wonder, would everybody say that Walz won this debate? A show of hands. No pressure. Okay. Not sure, Claire. Claire, you win.
I don't know what it means to win a debate.
Yeah, well, that's true.
I don't know what that definition is.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. Who you thought did better, I guess I should say. But you came into this not knowing. You said to me a few minutes ago, you're still not sure who you're going to vote for. You may not vote at all. And I remember during the big section of the debate that was about abortion, you were having some strong reactions to some of that.
Again, it's very hard to look at two men telling you what to do. Decisions are between a woman and her doctor, and there should be no one that interferes with that. And I think it's just kind of ridiculous that we are even in support. If Donald Trump or Joe Biden cared about this country, neither one of them would have won for election, right? We wouldn't be in this situation. They're 80 years old. Joe Biden has already, rescinded his nomination and everything. So we're talking about two people who probably should have run at all. And we're talking about two parties who gave us two candidates. Like, again, if you cared about us, we're like, oh, does that person care about me? No, they don't, because they wouldn't be there if they did. And they would have passed the torch to someone who is younger, is more capable, is less volatile. It could have won a real
true. Did pass the torch to Harris ultimately.
Right, but that's not like I didn't get to really vote for anyone in a primary election for either candidate and stuff. Like, don't we love seeing a big panel of Democratic Party, candidates and a big panel of Republican Party candidates and making our own choices? Instead, we again got handed two people, and that was our decision. It's not like we had a real political discourse or rhetoric around who was going to be our next president.
Meryl, you were really reacting to the very end of the debate when they were talking about January 6th, and they were talking about what happened on that day. And you're a very pro-Harris person, even coming in tonight. So what was it that was bothering you as you watched that?
So what really bothered me was how JD Vance pivoted the question and turned it into, really defended Donald Trump's position on January 6th. And the fact that he tried to avoid the answer, but it was really more about not recognizing. I wear this yellow pin for the hostages that are being held in Gaza. Donald Trump calls the insurrectionists that have been jailed after court trials they're now being jailed in Washington. He calls them hostages. I find that incredibly, incredibly offensive. They're not hostages. They're prisoners. They're people who were convicted and put in jail. And they were convicted of causing an insurrection, of violating the Capitol, of the people's house, and that there's even an attempt to justify that or turn it into something, calling them patriots, I find incredibly, incredibly offensive.
John, I think you had a similar reaction.
Yeah, the one point I thought was telling was that JD Vance tried to say that he was defending Trump's right. He wanted to have a debate in the public square. And then January 20th happened, and he left the office, and he completely yada-yada'd the insurrection at the Capitol. And I thought it was interesting that in his argument for having that debate, he says that it's our freedom of speech to allow misinformation, which it was interesting because most of his responses I thought were, he sounded well, he's very well poised, but they were like dodges and mistruths. And he got away with that throughout the night. Whereas Walz, I thought, responded very quickly with interesting points, with statistics and actual facts that supported his argument.
Rona, I want to ask you, because on the issue of Israel and foreign policy, you were thinking about voting for Trump. You said a couple of weeks ago you were really strongly considering voting for Trump, and now you're not so sure. What did you not hear tonight? Was there something J.D. Vance could have said to make you go, yeah, that's what I'm doing?
I mean, I think that if either of them would have made very, very clear statements about support for our strongest ally in the Middle East, support for Israel, about ending any kind of appeasement policy toward Iran or toward other Islamist regimes, toward ensuring that we are, well, he did say, I mean, Vance said peace through strength. I mean, obviously it's just like a slogan, but to the extent that that there is a party that would actually live that slogan, that's something that I find really, really valuable and something that I would be paying attention to. Getting the American hostages out, I mean, the reality is I don't know if Trump would have done a better job, but we have had a Biden administration, and there are American hostages, not just Israeli hostages. There are American hostages that are languishing in Gaza. There are Americans who have been killed in Gaza, and I don't think the administration is doing anywhere near enough to get them out.
I should mention that both Rona and Merrill, you're part of the Jewish community here in Pittsburgh, which is a sizable community for the size of the city that it is. I want to turn to you, Brandon, because you were basically with Harris. You feel even more strongly that way, I think, if I'm reading you right, after the debate. And you were talking to me about immigration because you work with nonprofits who help immigrants, among other things, right? You work with a lot of different nonprofits in town. What did you hear on housing and the immigrants' effect on housing that you were talking to me about how you didn't appreciate that?
Well, number one, Vance akin immigration to the housing crisis, which is, in my opinion, dishonest. That is not something that is prevalent to affect everybody across the board. What's happening here is he's putting more fear on this, and he's only talking about the southern border. And when I hear the southern border, obviously I hear the Latino community. So that's just more fear mongering. What we see is people trying to acquire equity. What we see is people trying to buy a home, people who are trying to avoid experiencing homelessness, and unfortunately, that's not directly linked to the immigration in the way that Vance is talking about it, because the illegal immigrants are not sitting in the C-suites denying home loans. They're not sitting in the C-suites denying these opportunities where people are trying to get equity, where people are trying to put their family in a safe environment, because being housed goes beyond just simply having a home, but it goes to being safe also.
Brandon, thank you. Thank you to all of you for staying up really late tonight. Hallie, I have to say, this is a late night for everybody. It's not a scientific sample, but it's interesting to hear what a group of people thought.
Fascinating, and I hope that somebody is brewing up a pot of coffee for all of you. So, Kate, thank you. Please, our thanks to all of them for staying up late with us tonight here on NBC News. Thank you, Kate Snow. Let me bring back in Chuck Todd and Kristen Welker, who are both with us. Kristen, I'll start with you in reaction to what we heard from that voter panel. I mean, that's what it's about, right? Is what do people in these key battleground states, like where Kate is, what do they think and how are they going to vote?
Well, I think what's interesting is that you didn't hear a lot of them say that they were overwhelmingly swayed by Senator J.D. Vance, who, as we are saying, you got a number of texts, I got a number of texts saying that he, from a performance standpoint, had the stronger night. But if you listen to those voters, that's not exactly what they were focused on. And I did think it was really notable to hear from the voter at the end there who said that the January 6th exchange did really bother her. It's a sign that exchange that happened at the very end of the debate is resonating with some of those undecided voters. Could that help her to make her final decision? It seems as though it helped to push her a little bit toward the Harris-Walz camp.
Yeah. Chuck, let me come to you because there's a phrase that you said at the beginning of our coverage here that is sticking with me, and it is polite word salad is something that you heard a lot of, right? Which I think is an interesting description. But there were some moments that went beyond that into the territory of revisionist history when it came to some of the comments that Senator Vance made about January 6th, for example, and some of the comments on a topic that came up a lot, which is health care. Came up a lot, of course, with voters that we talked to, came up a lot on the debate stage there, with Senator Vance suggesting that former President Trump looked to salvage Obamacare, when in reality, the opposite was true. Of course, repealing Obamacare, as you know, was a core plank of the Trump administration at the time. How do you square that, Chuck?
Well, and listening to the voters that we're watching with Kate, you know, there was something else about watching tonight that struck me. While I thought Vance you know, if we were assessing JD Vance versus Tim Walz, we'd say JD Vance did better than Tim Walz. But what if I told you your job was to make the case for your ticket or prosecute a case against the other ticket? And if you scored the debate that way, I'd argue Walz was much more aggressive at prosecuting a case against Trump. He did it very effectively on health care, the moment you're bringing up, versus Vance, who seemed at times, I think, trying to improve his own image, did not, certainly attacked Harris at times and would do this odd, like, well, I think Tim's serious about this, but I don't know if Harris is, right? You know, he would shield him from this. But I was struck by, look, I think that the Trump campaign has some work to do to reattach Biden's brand to Harris. I assumed Vance would be doing more of that tonight, and he didn't. Walz seemed to be more focused on improving Harris, right, rather than himself. So, and I think sometimes in these VP debates, and frankly all presidential debates, we all can get caught up in style. The voters are listening for specific, right? Every voter, you know, sort of, it doesn't do this for, they have a couple of issues they're listening for, right? And I think on the 3 or 4 issues that matter the most, I do think Walz seemed to be more prepared and aggressive in going after Trump, right? Not Vance, but Trump, and using Vance as a foil to do it, than Vance did with Walz. And I think it's interesting. When I heard those comments from the focus group, it reminded me that, boy, you know, did Vance do enough of the, frankly, what a VP's job usually is, a running mate's job usually is you got to play the hatchet man. And he didn't whip out the hatchet tonight.
Chuck Todd, super interesting. Chuck, thank you. Let me take you back to the spin room now, because, well, we are about an hour now past the end of the debate. Tom Yamas knows that the spinning is in full effect, if you will. Hey, friend.
Yeah, we're also waiting for some big-name guests that are going to join us live here in our special coverage. In the meantime, we'll go to another big-time correspondent while we wait, and that's Garrett Haake. Garrett, my question to you tonight is this. Do we honestly think that the Trump campaign is done with debates? Was this the last debate of this election cycle?
I think if JD Vance had done worse tonight, the odds would go up that Trump would debate again. But I do think the campaign is very satisfied with his performance here tonight. Look, in a lot of ways, JD Vance can be a better spokesperson for Trump than Trump. Certainly on the debate stage he was. He doesn't step on rakes. He doesn't kind of walk into some of these trap questions in the same way that Donald Trump does. He hits the Trumpian points in a smoother way. He also made up, for example, a fan fiction history of Obamacare almost on the spot about what Donald Trump did to rescue Obamacare that wholly did not happen. The Trump campaign doesn't see that as a negative. They think they sort of win the argument on something like that. But I think as long as Donald Trump feels like the race is close, and as long as he feels like he is his own best spokesman, which he often does, the door remains at least partially open to another debate.
Yeah, Garrett, and what are you hearing from the Trump campaign as far as how Vance did tonight? You mentioned earlier they were very happy. Were they surprised at the tone of the debate, that it wasn't, you know, the name calling wasn't as ugly as other debates we've seen in the past?
I think, no, I don't think they were particularly surprised by that, because I think it's clear that JD Vance came in with that as a strategy, that he was going to be a little bit more understated tonight, and that he was going to, I think, read the room to a certain extent and not come, you know, fully gloves off for Tim Walz when the situation didn't call for it. I think it might have looked excessive. We basically had two men on stage trying to out Midwestern nice each other at different points here. But I think from the Trump campaign's perspective, it was still effective for Vance. He was still able to go after Kamala Harris on the things that mattered and really sort of go through or around Tim Walz. It was not nearly as much about Tim Walz, except for the exchanges about, you know, that abortion bill in Minnesota, for example, much more focused on the top of the ticket. And when that person's not on the stage with you, it can affect the tenor of the discussion. And I think we saw that tonight.
There definitely was a lot of niceness on that stage. All right, Garrett, we appreciate all your reporting. With me now live, former President Trump's son and executive vice president of the Trump Organization, Donald Trump Jr. Don, great to have you here tonight. Thanks for being here. First question to you. Senator Vance is your guy. That's what you put out on Twitter today. How do you do?
I thought it was a masterclass. I know they went after him so hard for a few months, and even some of the Republican sort of establishment class, but I've gotten to know him over the last few years. His life story, his background, everything was just, he's just an incredible guy. And, I heard you guys talking about sort of tenor and demeanor. Yeah. The reality is the tenor and demeanor that you saw tonight from JD Vance, that's actually who he is. Again, I understand what they do. They've done it to me. They do it to my father. They'll vilify you and make you a terrible person. That's who he actually is. I mean, he's a very well thought out guy. He understands the policy. He gets into the details, almost to a wonky level. I mean, I think it felt like he had a better command of the policies that Tim Walz actually signed into law than Tim Walz himself. It was funny. I was watching and I commented on Twitter. I'm seeing Tim Walz sort of nodding in agreement to literally everything JD was saying. I was like, I think he's going to be a Trump Vance voter, based on that debate. So I thought it was a masterclass performance, just flawless.
You and your dad are both fighters. You've gotten aggressive over the last couple election cycles. You're not afraid to go there. Yeah. Did you want him to get more aggressive, or were you okay with him?
I don't think he needed to. I mean, there's a time, again, I get aggressive because, when I'm put into a situation that requires it. I mean, for years, I was called an agent of Russia. They wanted to try me for treason, a crime punishable by death. I did 50 hours of congressional testimony for those things. Hunter Biden, the laptop was Russian disinformation, according to all the intelligence agents. Well, it turns out it wasn't. Yeah. I don't think I'd have gotten the Hunter Biden treatment. It turns out everything they accused me of, he was doing, and far worse. So I understand that difference. You lie about me that way, I'll fight. That's who I am. That's who my father is. Doesn't mean it has to be that way. Yeah. And again, I think you saw a lot of that decorum tonight. So I was actually glad to see it, because I'd love to see more of that in the political space.
Part of Senator JD Vance, the things that you guys liked about him was his personal story. He mentioned fentanyl tonight and his mother, how she fought drug addiction. Let's listen to that.
I had a mother who struggled with opioid addiction and has gotten clean. I don't want people who are struggling with addiction to be deprived of their second chance, because Kamala Harris let in fentanyl into our communities at record levels. So you've got to stop the bleeding.
How did that life story sort of weigh into your decision to kind of back Senator Vance? Because, look, there were a lot of qualified Republicans that were up for the nominee to be the nominee. Senator Marco Rubio, Senator Tim Scott, Governor Doug Burgum. But this was your guy, and you're getting a lot of credit for bringing him on the ticket. Why?
Listen, I got to know that story. We sort of joke about it. Like, I grew up literally down the road here on the 70th floor of Trump Tower overlooking Central Park. He grew up in Appalachia, and yet we still have sort of a similar worldview. In talking to him about that, he's someone who understands that cycle of poverty and addiction. He broke through it. He's living the ultimate American dream. I mean, he got out of a household with addiction and poverty, goes into the Marine Corps, comes back, goes to Yale Law School, starts an incredible business, gets into politics, becomes a United States Senator. I mean, that's the American dream. My father and JD Vance want Americans, they want to give them the chance to thrive again, not barely survive. Mm-hmm. That's what we're doing right now. People are barely surviving. We see that in costs. We see that in what's going on around the world. We see that in, even honestly, and I'll call it out on the Republican side, many Republicans just wanting to go to war over things that they can't even articulate, why. Ukraine, for example, we spent $250 billion. We can't take care of our children. We can't take care of our vets. Our education system's terrible, and yet we're going to endlessly fund that rather than things at home. So, I saw someone who was able to break through that. That's someone who can effectuate real change for real Americans who actually need it.
How does he connect with your father? Because they seem like drastically different people.
It's interesting. They actually have a very good relationship. And, again, I think I joke, I expended about 15 years worth of political capital to both, help JD Vance out in the original Senate primary and then for VP. But every time I see him on TV, every time I see him on the Sunday shows, going into hostile media territory.
Did it take your dad convincing? Did you have to convince him?
It was a lot of work. Well, there's a lot of interest, a lot of people in my ear. What's unique about my father is he will listen to everyone. He'll ultimately make his own decision. But, you have a lot of people in the billionaire donor class. They want their guy because, everyone wants their own little puppet in the White House. I wanted the opposite. I wanted someone, who got it and has lived that story and been a success. And, every day I feel very vindicated when I see JD, and I couldn't have been more proud than what I witnessed tonight.
Lasting impressions are very important. There was this moment towards the end of the debate. I want to get your take on it.
That's what we're asking you, America. Will you stand up? Will you keep your oath of office, even if the president doesn't? I think you've got a really clear choice on this election of who's going to honor that democracy and who's going to honor Donald Trump.
This, of course, was about January 6th and certifying the election. Your father had a running mate, Mike Pence. He is not on the ticket. You have Senator JD Vance. We were speaking to a focus group in Pennsylvania, undecided voters, and one of those voters said January 6th was important to her. It was very important to her. Do you think this hurts you with some swing voters?
Not even a little bit. The reality is I think the fact that the media is going to try to latch onto that as maybe the only thing that they could try to hit JD on is probably very telling. The reality is I understand that I'm the son of a billionaire from Manhattan. Last summer I took my children to McDonald's, my 2 boys coming back from a fishing trip, and it was $48. And Donald Trump Jr. looked at that and said, it's got to be wrong. What's going on here? That's what matters to people. Fighting wars in foreign lands, watching Iran for the first time, not through proxies, but directly strike an ally of us in the Middle East. I'm worried about my kids not having to go to war to fight for unknown reasons forever. We had peace under Donald Trump. We had prosperity under Trump. We've had the opposite under these last 4 years. And I understand the media will try to pretend that Kamala Harris is a fresh slate. She hasn't been in politics in 20 years. And more importantly, she hasn't even been a part of this administration. She copied the policies of this administration, didn't even change the source code onto her page. It's going to be more of the same. And I understand they're trying to create this moderate Kamala Harris, but she has a long record of being a radical San Francisco liberal. She's the daughter of a Marxist professor. That doesn't just change, but she'll tell you anything you need to hear to vote for her. So you had 4 years under Trump. You had 4 years under Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. When were you safer? When did you have more money in your pocket? We can bring that back. We just have to actually make real change.
Last question. You guys have attacked Kamala Harris sorry, you're throwing me now. Kamala Harris for not doing interviews, for not sitting down doing town halls, but she wants to do another debate, and your father says he doesn't want to do a debate. Explain that to me. I'm trying to understand that.
My father offered to do another debate with her on Fox News weeks ago. She turned it down because Kamala Harris, like when she does an interview and Tim Walz has to sit next to her, she's not capable of doing it.
She debated him already.
She can only, yes. When it was a 3-on-1 debate with moderators that were so biased, even people in the media were calling it ridiculous.
But Don, your dad was commander-in-chief. He can handle 2 moderators. I saw him handle 15 Republican candidates.
She can't handle an interview with Oprah. Oprah's sitting there rolling her eyes. That's how bad it is. People understand that. When they hear her talk off teleprompter for more than a few seconds, they realize there's absolutely no substance there.
But explain to me why he doesn't want to do it. Explain to me.
Again, he offered to do it because she will only do it in hostile territory to us, where she knows that she's going to get every moderator functioning as her marketing department. That's why she turned down the other debate. My father offered that weeks ago. She won't do that.
You think this is the last debate of this election?
I imagine so. And I think there's no, the reality is this. Again, the facts speak for themselves. When were you better off? When were you safer? When were you not worried about wars? We were signing peace deals in the Middle East. That was the holy grail of geopolitical politics, right? That was the holy grail. We actually did that. Everyone said it could never even be done. Everyone promised they'd do it. No one actually got it done. My father did. Now we're on the brink of World War III with Iran attacking Israel. That's not a good place for our children. That's not a good place for America. Russia, Iran have effectively endorsed Kamala Harris. Iran is hacking on our campaign and giving the information to the Harris-Biden administration. They want Kamala Harris to win because Iran, Russia, and China know that a weak America is good for them. That's why they're pushing Kamala Harris. They're chomping at the bit for it. They would love that to happen. It would be a disaster for America.
Don Jr., we thank you for answering our questions. We thank you for being here on our special coverage.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Hallie, I'm going to send it back over to you in New York in our 30 Rock studios.
Tom, thank you very much. Joining me now here in New York is Hogan Gidley, former National Press Secretary for the Donald Trump 2020 campaign, and Max Rose, former Democratic Congressman from New York. Welcome to the both of you. Thank you for being here with us. Hogan, let me pick up for continuity here on something that Tom was just talking about with Donald Trump Jr. Why no more debates?
Well, I think Donald Trump has obviously had an opportunity to debate not just Joe Biden at this point, but Kamala Harris as well.
If you were advising him, Hogan, if you were still, officially on the campaign payroll and advising him, would you say just go do it?
No, I wouldn't. A lot of things go into, these decisions on whether or not you should go debate somebody, and he's already done this multiple times. Democrats, of course, changed their candidate, went with Kamala Harris after Joe Biden got out of, or after Joe Biden lost to Donald Trump in that debate, and then everyone wanted him out. So why would you go back and do this all over again? And not to mention the fact I think Don Jr. was right. I mean, there are several of those moderators who are going up against, working kind of for the Biden-Harris campaign, attacking Donald Trump, fact-checking Donald Trump, not doing anything to Kamala Harris, not doing anything with Joe Biden. And so why would you go back into those situations? I think pretty much right now we have a set race where there is a core base of support for Donald Trump, a core base of support for Kamala Harris. I don't know the debate would change anything.
I mean, to the point of going after moderate, again, these are people who are well equipped to handle world leaders, much less, you know, moderators and debates. Let me ask you this, because it's kind of the same, a similar point here, Congressman. Why not get Tim Walz out there in more unscripted settings, doing more interviews? That is something that you've already seen, I think, in some of the reaction coming from Democratic strategists who are suggesting maybe he was a little bit too nice on the debate stage tonight. And if he had done more unscripted interviews, he'd have a little bit more comfort level on a night like this.
Yeah, look, I think he did what he had to do tonight.
You did? You think he executed on the mission he needed to go through?
Yeah, certainly. And I think that they, in some ways, they both executed on their own objectives, right? I mean, JD Vance had to go out there and show America that he's not just like a total sociopath. And potentially he achieved that. And Tim Walz went out there and showed that he's an effective leader and has the chops to be the vice president of the United States. So there were different bars for both. And they both could have been more aggressive, certainly. But in the end, though, I got to turn this back to the debate. It's a sad situation for Donald Trump when him and his allies, family and otherwise, are trying to stumble around looking for some excuse as to why he doesn't want to debate anymore, when the obvious reason is staring us right in the face. He got trounced in the last debate and doesn't want to do it again.
Yeah,
the reason why I think, you know, it's funny, Savannah and Lester were doing the special report right before this broadcast, and Savannah, show of hands, do you want to see a debate? Now, I'm not typically a show of hands kind of person, right? But in this instance, I think of course, journalists want transparency. We want to hear from the people who folks are either electing or might be about to elect. I think generally, right, as a journalist, debates are a good thing. The more you hear from candidates are a good thing. And I bring this up because what we saw tonight were a lot of questions on policy, substantive issues from healthcare to the economy to foreign policy on Iran and Israel and much more, climate change, for example, which is not something that's come up a lot. It would be an opportunity for Donald Trump to speak more clearly about some of his policy positions on, for example, immigration and how you would actually implement mass deportations, which J.D. Vance did not answer. To speak more clearly on his position on abortion access, for example, he did make some news on that front tonight, tweeting out during the debate that he would not support a national abortion ban, that he would veto that. Why did it take him so long to come to a policy position on that front?
Listen, we're having a conversation on this stage right here about whether or not we should have more debates. Of course, the American people deserve to know what these politicians think. But Donald Trump was president of the United States. He has a policy record. People's lives were better. Everyone knows that. He could go out there and say that more, and he does that every single day. He does interviews with hostile interviewers. He goes out and does his campaign rallies, etc. Kamala Harris typically doesn't. She has a few friendlies she goes to every once in a while. She gives the same speech at every rally.
But
fine.
let's also
That's
acknowledge that former President Trump also goes to, in many instances, friendly interviewers.
Of course. But I'm just saying, these people are out all the time having these discussions. So they're not going to debate again unless Donald Trump changes his mind. He also said he would debate on Fox. She wouldn't do it. He's already done one, on CNN and also on ABC. Two entities we deem hostile to our side. He went into those places and had those debates. Kamala Harris would never go on Fox News and do a debate, ever.
You know, presidential elections particularly are about the future, not the past. JD Vance is obviously a smart guy, and Donald Trump is getting old, so I'm not going to hold him accountable for this. But what was interesting about JD Vance's debate tonight is how shallow he was about the future. Could not answer with any specifics about addressing the child care crisis, could not answer with any specifics how he would change the ACA as they purportedly want to improve upon it, could not answer with any specifics how he would execute this mass deportation that they talk about each and every day in a humane manner at all. So that they don't have any policy specifics. It's a failure of their actual campaign, not even one individual.
Let me just ask you this, though, because here we are, and we talked about this a minute ago, and it's something that I think is important to remind people. Early voting is happening. Yeah. In key battleground states. Early voting is going to be rolling out increasingly over the course of the next 2.5 weeks, right? You look at, I think it's the 17th or the 19th that you have one of the last of the key Sunbelt battlegrounds that goes for in-person early voting. Did anything that happened here tonight move the needle to a degree that could make a difference in this race, in your view? Congressman?
Absolutely. 100%. You know, I think that there was, and you saw actually the Walz team lowering expectations going into this. There was some sense that I think people were thinking, oh, this guy's just, jovial. Right, he's just a
folksy, sticky,
folksy, sticky, this and that. The ultimate Midwestern guy, and I say that as a kid from Brooklyn with limited knowledge of what that means. But in the end, he showed that he is a truly competent leader with incredible experience in government.
Yeah, I think it matters when you're talking about elections decided by 42,000 votes across 3 states. JD Vance came out, and I think a lot of people seeing him for the first time after this caricature was painted of him by the media and others. People realize, wait a minute, this guy's had a hard upbringing, a tough life with a mother who was an addict, was raised by his grandmother. They couldn't make ends meet all the time. And he's not this vicious, crazy person that he was painted to be. Instead, he's someone who understands the policy, has a grasp on it, and he did a good job exposing the radical nature of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. Tim didn't even really talk about Kamala Harris. He couldn't because she has no policies. He just kept talking about Donald Trump the whole time.
All right, so both of you think that this could maybe make a difference when voters go and hit the ballot box. Hogan, Max, thank you both very much. Tom Yamas, I'll bring you back in there at the spin room. To the point that both Hogan Gidley and Max Rose were making, this is an election that will be decided absolutely on the margins. You know this, as I know you're digging into some of those key counties and those key battlegrounds here. I've been out on the road talking to folks about those big issues like the economy and immigration. This is going to be a competitive race over the course of the next 35 days.
And it's interesting what's going to change the race, right? Because if that's it with the debates, no more debates. It's unclear if there'll be any more consequential interviews after this Sunday. What else voters do? What else do they have to sort of make up their mind? They're going to have to watch our coverage and other coverage and sort of go from there. That's going to do it for our coverage tonight. I'm Tom Yamas in the spin room.
And I'm Hallie Jackson here in New York on behalf of all of us here at NBC News. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.